Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well and thank you for joining this webinar hosted by the Aurelius Foundation. Today we have 4 young Stoics on our panel discussing their Stoic journeys and perspectives. This will be the first of a 3-part series, so stay tuned for more upcoming webinars soon. During the webinar today, please feel free to type any questions or comments at any time throughout the webinar. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar, so you can just type the questions through there. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. Please also check out and follow our social channels, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and also check out our website for all previous content on previous webinars, events, etc. And that's www.aureliusfoundation.com. I hope you enjoy today's discussion, and now I'm going to pass over to Justin, founder of the Foundation.
Thank you, Holly, and good evening, everyone, London time. We've got quite a number of people joining us from around the world, including one of the panelists. So we're delighted to do this particular webinar for multiple reasons: to continue the dialogue through the Foundation and awareness, but also to share perspectives on Stoicism, the journey of Stoicism from a younger generation. So I'm very delighted to host this webinar this afternoon. We've got a few things to catch up at the end and some news items as well, upcoming events and also building into next year. I thought it might be an idea to just remind everyone on this particular slide that one of the key vision points of the Foundation is to increase awareness and to share principles of Stoic philosophy based on the 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. And we all know that through the goals of the Foundation. But in particular, we want to focus on the Foundation's endeavors to share this philosophy with younger people starting out in life, or starting in their first professional career, or they're at a younger stage in life. When I make that comparison to what Stoicism has contributed to my life. So this is a really key point for the Foundation. It's really the essence of what the Foundation is trying to achieve. And the Foundation is dedicated to youth and youth development through the education of higher principles and the values of Stoic philosophy. And we certainly believe that this can contribute very positively and constructively to change in someone's life, but also the ripple effect for the greater good. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce this afternoon's panelists that have been so kind to join me. So first of all, Laurie.
Hi everyone, this is Laurie here. So just to give you a little background into my experience, who I am a graduate analyst currently working in London for an investment bank, and I've recently graduated having majored in philosophy. I went to Royal Holloway, and I'm very happy to be sharing with you my experience, my thoughts on Stoicism, as it's had a big impact on my life so far. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you. I've just got a small technical issue here, which we're sorting through. Making sure everyone can see that. Thank you, Laurie. Our next panelist is Sukraj, please.
Hi, everyone. So this is me in a nutshell, really. I live in London as well, and I practice as a solicitor. And actually, I've discovered I'm very close to Laurie as well. I was introduced to Stoicism through the Foundation, and it's been a really interesting journey. I look forward to sharing it with you. In my personal time, I now enjoy reading around different Stoic ideas and practice. I enjoy keeping fit, yoga, and do lots of voluntary work for a children's reading charity as well. Back to you, Justin.
Great. So that's Laurie, and here, thank you again, Sukraj. And Ross, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Justin. So, as you can see there, my name is Ross. I'm a National Security Master's student at King's College London. And additionally, alongside my degree, I work within the public sector in counter-extremism, which, as you can imagine, is occasionally quite stressful. And so Stoicism has been really helpful to me there. And in my spare time, as you can see, I enjoy things like running, writing, and practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a martial art which is very similar in some ways to Stoicism.
Very good. Thank you, Ross. And Dhruv, over to you. And I will give Dhruv a special mention because he's actually calling in from New Zealand, which is probably about 6 a.m. there. So Dhruv, we appreciate, and I personally appreciate your support of the foundation and early morning there in New Zealand. But Dhruv, a quick introduction from you.
Yeah, that's very kind of you to say. I'm happy to be able to do this and be given the opportunity. But yeah, I'm Dhruv, everyone. I'm a PhD student right now. Before that, I used to work in the finance industry as a software developer. And yeah, I like Stoicism, but I also like a bunch of other things like cooking, reading, like to go hiking, do some activism. Yeah, that's me. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you. So as you can see here, we've got a wide audience. And I'm coming back to this slide just which I mentioned previously. George Bernard Shaw said once that youth is a wonderful thing. It's a pity it's wasted on the young. And from getting to know the four of these young Stoics and aspiring Stoics, there's one thing that they are not doing, and that's in any way wasting their youth. They are dynamic, they're positive, they're proactive, and they're looking to bring great purpose into their lives as they start out on and they're well into some of their careers in any case. So what we'd like to do, starting with Ross actually, is just have a conversational update, really, Ross, how you discovered Stoicism, why it resonates with you, and then some practical examples of how you bring Stoic discipline into your life. And I'll just reiterate again that we're going to develop this conversation with different parts of the panel in the next weeks as well. But we wanted today to give the opportunity for everyone to meet this group, and then we'll continue dialogues. But Ross, over to you. Discovering, resonating, applying Stoicism. Love to get your initial thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. So I discovered Stoicism actually while I was studying my undergraduate degree in West Wales, which, as you can imagine, is very different to the London setting I find myself in now. So it was quite a rural setting, and at the time I actually discovered Stoicism not through the original text, but actually through public figures who have discussed Stoicism, and particularly public figures like, for example, Tim Ferriss and Ryan Halliday, who are quite popular in sort of business world and additionally in the world of sort of ideas about increasing productivity. So initially I came at Stoicism through that angle. And it was really valuable at the time because, as I think any student will empathize with me, having a sort of a framework through which at the time it was helpful to be more productive, especially with looming deadlines and dissertations, was really, really useful. But at the time, I think I had quite a limited understanding of Stoicism because I really saw it as just about increasing productivity, really. And I think misinterpreted sort of the main parts of Stoicism because I had it through quite a specific angle. But as sort of I read around and my interest was piqued by friends sort of seeing them reading Marcus's Meditations, and additionally the work of Seneca as well, I gradually got more involved with the main text and the original text themselves, and got to grips with some of the main tenets of the wisdom. And one example that I wanted to touch on that I think has been really helpful more generally in my life and appreciating life is really about impermanence, I think. So Epictetus, who was a slave himself, talks about whenever you take delight in something, bring to mind the contrary impression. Now, initially, when he's talking about this, he uses quite a morbid example. He talks about sort of death, and saying that actually, when you think about death more, you tend to appreciate your life more as well, because you realize the impermanence of life. And that's something which I think is really, really crucial. More generally, is that we realize the impermanence of our relationships, whether it's with our family and friends and various other things that we have in our lives, because that's precisely what makes it special. And so to me, it's been a lesson in gratitude more generally for things that I have, the relationships that I have, and really valuing those things. And I think specifically in my own life where I've applied Stoicism, I'd say within my job, as I think I briefly mentioned in the introduction, it can be often quite stressful dealing with sort of counter-extremism and high-profile issues like terrorism, and safeguarding individuals who are vulnerable to that. But I think certainly things like the dichotomy of control. So really understanding what's in my control and what isn't, and therefore not getting stressed about things which are outside of my control, and just doing the best that I can within my actions, really. And I found those sorts of really basic, but ultimately really, really practically useful lessons to be very valuable. And back to you, I think, there, Justin.
Very good. I think there's a couple of points here that we might get into a wider discussion and opinions soon about Seneca versus Aurelius versus others, not really versus, but your comparisons from a perspective, who resonates from a different perspective, from a generational perspective. Also time and youth. I can remember thinking in my 20s and 30s I had so much time, but in the grand scheme of things, we don't. So utilizing that time, and I think from a younger perspective is interesting. And then of course, in today's world, with the massive amounts of distraction and social media and access to all sorts of medium immediately, the dichotomy of control is a very interesting discussion as well. But thank you, Ross, for those thoughts. So next, over to Sukraj, and really this quote is an interesting perspective as well. But Sukraj, you're again discovering, resonating, and application of Stoicism. We'd love to hear your
Thanks, Justin. So I had a somewhat rocky start to my Stoic journey. I'd like to share that with you because I think it really helps illustrate the value of time, and to Ross's point about the impermanence of life. So I was extremely ill very suddenly, and as someone with very robust health throughout my whole life, it was very sudden and a big shock. I was actually introduced to Stoicism in the very early stages of my recovery through the foundation. And as someone who by nature is very driven, very goal orientated, very focused on my career, the first thing I did in the early stages of recovery, once somewhat mobile, was to really think about what can I do to make up the time that I've lost in illness. So it really was a turning point being introduced to Stoicism at that stage. And this particular quote really sang to me because it helped me understand that something had happened. I had to accept that this had happened, that it had been prescribed to me, and as a consequence, really to learn from that. And through my own nature, not every challenge is to be addressed by driving at it and throwing all my energy into it. So what led thereafter was really a lot of reflection, a lot of introspection as I embraced Stoicism, and really thinking about the value of time. So to both of your points, Justin, Ross, where are we spending our time? Is my time going towards bringing me to the person I want to be, to the goals that I want to achieve? And should my life, or the bonus time that I have now, end tomorrow, would I be satisfied as the person that I am, should my life end tomorrow? And I think that's something we really need to think about. And certainly anybody who's dialed in today that hasn't already seen the webinar and commentary on Seneca and the views on time, please do visit the website, go to the seminar library. It's very, very useful. And it's one that I watched quite a few times during my recovery. Back to you, Justin.
Very good. I think one of the interesting points you make there, Sukraj, is around acceptance and acceptance within the circumstances. You know, even in business right now, I'm counseling and working with my management teams, talking about we are in the middle of a pandemic. Don't rush it. It is what it is. Society is trying to unfold the situation possibly too quickly, and knowing whether the society has a problem of wider sickness or an individual has a disease that they're working through. The Stoics bring great comfort to that point in time, to where you are, trying to understand that and trying to accept it and trying to work through it in a methodical manner. So your comments are very well taken. Right, next, moving on to Laurie. Great quote here, one of my favorites as well, from Seneca. And Laurie, over to you. Discovery, resonating, and application. This is a fantastic quote.
Sure, thank you. So my introduction to Stoicism came through from an academic perspective. I was in my second year of university when I attended the seminar on Stoicism. I had never heard of it before. Initially what appealed to me was the novelty of the ideology, the ideas that were summarized in that 1 hour seminar. I later found out that into my third year at university, I was able to enroll in a whole module focused on Stoicism. So I started out doing politics, philosophy, and economics, and into my third year, I decided to drop everything else and just focus on philosophy. I was lucky enough to have Dr. John Sellers as my lecturer on this module, who has produced a lot of work on Stoicism. And I think for me, I kind of initially took it as a mission for self-development, for self-mastery, and I very much tried to focus on the cardinal virtues, particularly moderation, that I thought was my weakest point. So that's how I started out. I then kind of realized it resonated with a lot of other principles that I had come to really embrace throughout my time at university. And the more I read, the more I realized this is something that I want to incorporate into my life, not just as an exercise, not just as a week or for in terms of theoretical knowledge, but I realized this was something that I wanted to become a lifestyle. It offered me a lot of calmness, I would say. It brought a lot of serenity in my life. And I think I've come to a point where I don't have to think about all of the quotes or all of the readings to kind of think in a Stoic way, which I think kind of links to the quote, which has become part of my day-to-day life. So I do believe we do suffer more in imagination than in reality. And what I understand by that is that, according to the Stoics, it's not what happens to us or what we face that determines how we feel about ourselves, about life. It's our interpretation of it, it's our judgment. And they do emphasize the point that it's not external constraints that kind of hinder us or bind us in any way. It's more the impact that we give it ourselves by interpreting them in a certain way. So in terms of applying Stoicism, I think I don't tend to ascribe to daily sort of reflections or meditations, but what I do, which is a very prescriptive sort of thing, is what they call the premeditation of future evils. I kind of always, whenever I go into any social circumstance, either at work, either in general, I sort of do think, okay, if this is a particularly challenging task, particularly daunting occasion, what's the worst thing possible that could happen? And if that's the case, then what am I going to do about it? So I think that also links with the dichotomy of control. If there is something I can do about it, then, and I see fit to do so, then I will. If I don't, then I let it go, I let it be, and that brings a lot of comfort to me. So that's kind of a brief summary. Back to you, Justin.
Very good. And Laurie, one of the things I think that you've conveyed very strongly here is the working through possibilities when you're going into situations, which I think I see when, for example, in the business world, young people doing presentations for the first time and how horribly nervous they get and how difficult that can be. But there are techniques to manage that, and we'll touch on that in a moment, which is great. And Laurie, once again, it was very interesting when we had the launch event in London in March before the major lockdown. It was really gratifying for us as a foundation to have you on the stage at the end there talking with both John Sellers and Christopher as well. I thought it was really interesting, that particular discussion, because we had two, foremost Stoic philosopher advocates here in the UK, and was someone who was adopting the Stoic philosophy in a very powerful way as well. And to see that whole conversation coming together around it, I thought she did a terrific job, and it was very, very enlightening to a lot of people in that room to see how it could be played out from experts who know the philosophy in detail, but also then the utilization from a young professional woman who's getting on with her life very successfully.
Thank you.
Very good. So let's go then to Dhruv, who's, as mentioned, in New Zealand. So Dhruv, we'd love to hear about your discovery, resonating and application of Stoicism, and also why this particular quote resonates or is something that has an impact on you. Over to you, Dhruv.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you everyone else for sharing your wonderful stories. My journey into Stoicism has been quite a slow burn. It's been a meandering road, so I'll try and keep it brief. But basically, I was very casually recommended Stoicism, specifically meditations, by a friend before I went to university. And this is a friend I'd grown up with. And I bought the book, just kind of not really thinking about it. I trusted his recommendation. And so I bought the book, I read it, I enjoyed it, I found it very consoling. And this was a time in my life where I was quite satisfied and quite happy. I was about to enter university. Everything was really good. I then started university and things changed. And I think it wasn't so much my external circumstances. There were elements which had definitely been unfavorable in like the relative sense of the term. I had gone through a lot of major changes. It was a high pressure environment and I became quite stressed, depressed, just a real low point in my life. But even then, I'd be reading meditations and I'd find it very consoling. But I didn't put two and two together and think, well, if I did this more often, maybe I'd feel better generally. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm probably at like my lowest point in university, probably my lowest point in life. And I rediscover Stoicism on this podcast called Philosophize This. And I listen to not just kind of the later Stoics, but Philosophize This. It goes through Zeno and the early Stoics, the logic and the metaphysics, the middle Stoics, and then the later Stoics like Aurelius Seneca and Epictetus. And there, I was like, oh yes, okay, this definitely is something, it's not just meditation, there's something more to this. And it wasn't what they were saying, right? It wasn't so much what they were saying. I'd kind of grown up with these values in the Hindu culture that I was brought up in. So it wasn't surprising from that perspective. What was surprising, what was really relatable, was that these were very clear ideas and these were very human texts, right? When Seneca's writing his letters, you can imagine that someone's kind of 2,000 years from now, maybe like putting them out on a podcast today, when Epictetus is talking about the games, you can imagine he's talking about sports games today. You know, it's Seneca talking about busy people. Humans are still humans, right? And the clarity of the words, their concision, and the simplicity of the values was what really resonated. Not so much the content itself, but the presentation. And so from there, it was a very slow thing. First, it was just reading and understanding. It wasn't any particular practice that I jumped into. It was very slow. I just kept reading and learning more about it. Eventually, through my own volition, I was practicing by myself for a few years before I realized, or before I started to, let's say, listen to a daily podcast as opposed to a weekly one. Start journaling in the third person. And then only last year, when I was at Stoic on X and I saw your announcement on the foundation, that I think that it could be something I could do socially and with other people and talk to other people about. And yeah, and the reason that this particular quote resonates with me, it's because I look back on the past few years and there have been lots of major changes. I've moved cities at least 3 times, you know, left university, started a new job, left that job, started a PhD. And I've had transitions where I've not had Stoicism and where I have had Stoicism, kind of actively. And the difference is clear. The difference is night and day. But without those events, even the ones I hadn't handled that well, or the ones I had handled that well, I wouldn't have known what I was capable of, right? So the saying the storm demonstrates a pilot's work is like saying food demonstrates a chef's work. Like a chef is, without a kitchen and food, is just, you know, observationally equivalent to everyone else. But so I think there was a real reframing of challenges as something that actually is material, raw stuff for you to demonstrate what you've learned and what you've still to work on, rather than something that gets in your way. Back to you.
Well, very good. I think this particular quote again resonates with me, and it is something that, which I'll steal a little bit of thunder, but in John's book that we're going to recommend here again for people to have a good look at. But in that book, it ties into, there's one particular point that struck me in this quote, and it relates to John's book, is the habit of judgment. And this particular quote touches on that, in the sense that if you read this, the storm does not interfere with the pilot's work, only with his success. And we create the pressure sometimes by labeling the event or the outcome of the event. We judge it instead of the process. And we create unnecessary pressure at times because we've created a judgment of an outcome that we'd like to see happen. If it doesn't happen, or we create unnecessary pressure in the preparation and going through the process. And I think your quote here is very powerful in the sense that it does remind us that if you do the process right, in whatever field you're in, an athlete, a business person, in whatever approach, and you avoid judgment, it does allow you to keep a firmer, calmer hand on the rudder as you're going through the process of what you're trying to achieve, and again minimizes the emotional impact that can be very negative. Because I think no matter what stage in life, I was talking to a Stoic today, a fantastic lady who will be on a webinar soon, who will be joining us, a lady called, her name is Eve Richards. I won't steal the thunder about her soon, but we had a fantastic conversation, and we centered on one particular point around life. You know, life is not a matter of whether you will get knocked down. It's a matter of whether you will get up. And that's the key point. And I think this quote touches on that. And Stoicism does allow us a toolkit, to create a toolkit when you're on top. It's a powerful toolkit. When you're not and you're trying to work through problems, it's a powerful toolkit. And it's also a toolkit that allows you to stay pretty even keel in between those different valleys of success and failure and events that happen in your life. So what I'd like to ask the group is, you know, there's been references of Seneca, there's been references of Epicurus, there's been references of Aurelius this afternoon. So I'm going to start with Ross and just ask Ross, as you're reading Stoicism and you're reading from different sources, and I'll ask each of the panel this, is there any particular, whether it's either, you know, one of those guys or other Stoic, there's many other Stoics, but is there any particular source or author that you return to more often than others? And is there any reason why? So Ross, do you read more Aurelius, or do you read more Seneca, or do you read other sources? And how do you approach that?
Yeah, I have tended to gravitate towards Aurelius, partly because I just think it's so historically interesting that someone who was once the most powerful man on earth wrote down his thoughts in practically a diary. And just that by itself is enough to read it out of curiosity. But the lessons that he gives, I think, are remarkably relatable for someone who had as much power as he did. And I think particularly sort of he has a quote, if you'll indulge me, about ambition and sanity and self-indulgence. And he says, ambition means tying your well-being to what other people say and do. Self-indulgence means tying it to the things which happen to you. And sanity means tying it to your own actions. And I think that sort of mindset is really liberating, because I think we all have the tendency, whether it's at work, excuse me, or in other areas of our lives, when things go wrong, when people don't turn up to meetings, when people do things that we wouldn't have done, to sort of read motivations into it, when in reality it just is what it is. These things happen, and that's okay, and we should, I think, just move past those. And I think in that sense Aurelius was really, really valuable to me, for his relatability and his thoughts, despite the fact that, as I said, he was the most powerful man on earth at one point. Back to you, Justin.
Very good. No, I absolutely agree with that. Laurie, from your perspective, if reading across the Stoics, any particular author that you tend to revert to more or has a greater impact on you?
Sure. I think it would have to be two for me. It would have to be Seneca and Epictetus. Seneca provides a pretty broad range of topics that I've been able to explore. So he's written on anger, on the shortness of life, and those kind of short excerpts are very practical, very sort of concise, and just straight to the point, and very good examples of what a Stoic action is. And then Epictetus is anecdotally very interesting discourses. Epictetus's discourses provides a lot of such examples. One that I find kind of really just insightful into the whole ideology really is, so Epictetus was a slave, and he used to be treated very badly by his master, to the point that his master broke his leg. In the process of his master breaking his leg, he kept saying, be careful, or you'll push it too far. And then at one point he did break his leg, and then Epictetus didn't cry, he didn't say anything except for, I warned you. And then he continued to live with a limp for the rest of his life. But what he said was, lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the will. And I think that just goes to show that no matter what happens, it is your will that is the strongest asset that you have, and that you can cultivate. And I think if we're going back to the very basics of Stoicism, health in itself, and health, wealth, all of these things that we assume are what we want, what we need in life, they're mere indifference, according to the Stoics. Indifference in that we do not need them to survive. The greatest possible thing that we can aim for to have is virtue, and the greatest evil is then vice. Anything apart from that is an indifferent. And of course, it's a preferred indifferent to be in good health, to have different positive externalities. But at the end of the day, as long as you can get over any external constraints, then you have achieved self-mastery and are living in accordance with nature. And again, in accordance with nature, by that I mean living in a consistently rational manner, and kind of taking everything as it is, accepting that fate has brought you to a certain place, and what you can do about it is up to you only to a certain point. And that's it for me. Back to you.
Very good. I think sometimes when people are discovering Stoicism for the first time, especially potentially from a younger viewpoint, it's a difficult concept to get around the priorities and what is important and what isn't. And also trying to get across that from a Stoic perspective, that health, money, reputation, all those things that we spend a lifetime trying to build and take care of, from a Stoic perspective, aren't as important as necessarily we think they are in the pure Stoic sense. So that can sometimes be a struggle of understanding. And some of these perspectives, as the years go on, it is absolutely certain that how you feel in your 20s versus your 30s versus your 40s, and in my case, my 50s, that we value things differently. My wife is a little bit younger than me, so her perspectives are very refreshing for me, but we value things in some cases just a little bit differently, just based on the progression of life. It was very interesting to share those discussions together, and I think your summary there was very good. So let's go over to Sukraj, your thoughts around authorship and what some of the better persuasions that you move to within Stoic reading.
Yeah, I think from a slightly different perspective, I think I'm speaking from somebody who's discovered Stoicism very, very recently. So for context, for me, this is the beginning of a journey that's been about 6 months or so. And I think to Ross's point, meditations is really relatable. You wouldn't think one of the most powerful men in the world, someone my age will pick it up with little to no power, would open this book and think, actually, yes, I know where you're coming from. I feel the same way. I have the same difficulties. This really helps me. But actually, for anyone who's starting out on their Stoic journey, I found that really, really useful. But in combination with reading Seneca's letters and on the shortness of life, on saving time in particular, because that's where my focus is right now, a combination of the two has been really useful. I would say for anyone who is a starter Stoic or a budding Stoic, it can be a little bit daunting with the amount of material that's out there. And sometimes it can feel like there's a lot of academia. But actually, I think reading at the beginning, reading a combination, starting with some simpler texts can really help, because Stoicism for me, as it started out, is really practical. I would say read a little bit of everything, have an overview of the basic principles, and then really look at things in a practical way. I mean, I certainly haven't read one of Seneca's letters, or only read part of Meditations and then not revisited it. In the last 6 months or so, it has been a matter of perusing, reading again, rereading, considering things from different angles, turning them over in your mind and thinking about, how does this translate for me? How does this feel for me in my daily life? So as someone who has been starting out, I would say it's really helped to read a combination and then reflect on them.
Very good. Excellent summary. Drew, over to you. You mentioned a little bit that Aurelius, obviously, when you're obviously talking about a number of things, but is there anything else that you really think about, and you're well read on the subject? So I'd love to get your perspectives.
I view Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus as kind of how, let's say, ancient civilizations would have personified different aspects of an ideal personality in different deities. So if I can explain in a second, I like Meditations, and Aurelius to me is like quite an introspective person. If I need to retreat to my inner citadel, if I'm feeling like the world's closing in around me, I will probably go to Meditations, just so that I remember that there was someone, at least one person in the existence of humanity, who felt the same way that I do right now, right? And that's very consoling and reassuring. I feel like in temperament, I might relate most to Marcus, just because just feel kind of naturally introverted, but you still have to go out and do work, and you enjoy that, but sometimes it can get a bit much, sometimes it can be difficult. Whereas Seneca, as I see as someone who's like a very extroverted friend, right? Someone who you can approach with problems, rather than someone when you need someone to relate to, someone that you want to go to for guidance. I see Seneca as quite friendly. I see his letters as probably, like, apart from, like, say, John's book, which is a really good overview, each of Seneca's letters are very digestible, right? They're kind of complete in themselves, whereas a quote from Marcus can resonate quite a lot, but it can be difficult to understand how to embody it and apply it. Whereas Seneca's letters, they have that context and they have that conversational tone, which makes it a lot easier to understand the broader application of whatever idea he's specifically discussing. I've yet to read any of his essays, like On Anger or On the Shortness of Life, but I've heard quotes from them, and they've also been really influential. And so as I'm going through the authors, like I'm a few years into Stoicism, and I realized I haven't read Epictetus, and so picked up Epictetus a couple of years ago. And this was a time where I was feeling fairly confident with myself, and I knew that Epictetus was had this reputation of being quite a blunt person, a backhanded teacher almost, this tough love, and I found that as well. And so when I think of Epictetus, I think of someone who's very tough love, one who will give it to you straight, someone who will tell you as it is, right? And not beat around the bush too much. And that's sometimes what you need, right? You don't always need some cuddling. You just need to be able to tell, here's how it is, but I believe that you have the ability to do it, right? Because I think that everything that is bothering you is within your control, and everything that isn't is external to you doesn't need to bother you. And so, like, just recently, like, I was thinking about Epictetus, this might surprise some people, but in the context of dating or activism. And I found that wasn't his original intent, but when if you have that frame of mind and you read some of his works, you're like, oh yeah, I can handle this, right? And those are two very different scenarios, definitely to the ones that he would have been writing for 2,000 years ago. But it works, right? And so I see them as having these kind of different personalities, and depending on my mood, I go to each rather than having a particular preference.
Yeah.
Justin.
Thank you. Look, very good. I think sometimes, I've mentioned previously on different webinars, I start my day with Marcus Aurelius and I finish my day with Seneca. And, you know, I have different readings with Epictetus and so forth. But I do a lot of time around the emperors as well. I'm just finishing a autobiography right now around Augustus again. So, and I find Aurelius very interesting because of his total mindset, but I see the way that someone like Augustus changed the world. Both Roman emperors, both completely different. And their approach to ruling, in some ways, I think Marcus had the intent, what he wanted to do and so forth, but he still had the responsibility of managing an empire. Whereas Augustus was so incredibly focused and ruthless to a T when required, especially as he was climbing to the imperial throne and the battles that he had to undertake to get there. Whereas Marcus was nurtured in a different period of Roman history. So I think that Stoic mindset as Marcus, and you read that through as you go through different stages of the meditations. And I sometimes look at it, even referring back to Seneca, I'd like to have a cup of tea with Marcus Aurelius, but I'd like to have a few glasses of wine with Seneca. Because Seneca had to live through the Nero era, and that must have, obviously he saw the absolute worst in humankind and misuse of power. So in any case, look, thanks everyone. Well, we've got some questions coming through. So the first question for the panel is as follows: how the panelists feel about Viktor Frankl, who obviously wrote the book, The Meaning of Life. If you've read the book, the question is, how do you feel about Viktor Frankl, who wrote that our character and our ethics are tested through great difficulty? So it's really a commentary. Have you read the book? And if you have, that character and ethics are tested through great difficulty. Now, I was reading something this week. Are they, when you're under duress or tested, is your character, tested, or is it revealed? So first of all, starting with Ross, even a comment around Viktor Frankl in that book, but really more so around character and ethics and being tested through great difficulty, and Stoic thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Man's Search for Meaning is a fantastic book by Dr. Frankl, and really just tracing his experience through the Holocaust and what happened to him. But one of his only consolations, for those of you that haven't read the book, was that the people who obviously keeping him captive couldn't take away his character. That was within his control. And that ultimately that he could save himself from becoming someone that he despised by really being the best person he could be, despite his circumstances. That was still in his control. And so I think that one of the lessons, at least I took from that book, is that that no matter what your circumstances, your character is still ultimately in your control. And that I think in Victor's circumstances, the fact that he went through that must have, from judging what his comments were, must have really heightened his awareness of how important one's character is, and keeping your morals in check, even in the worst circumstances where otherwise emotionally you might feel about doing something else.
Yeah. Very good. Laurie, any comments around that book or around character and ethics under duress?
Sure. I haven't read the book, although by the sounds of it, it is something that I think I should probably do. I think around our behavior and how we grow to become who we really are, I think we're always developing, we're always learning. And I think one important element to Stoicism and what it has taught me, it's that it all takes time, and it's a daily exercise that you have to undergo to sort of overcome either internal or external sort of conflicts to achieve a sort of ideal character that you deem to be a virtuous. So I think in terms of adversity, again, the dichotomy of control does tell us that if it's within your control, you can do something about it, and if it's not, then you shouldn't even think of it. So that's it for me.
Dhruv, anything from you on that book, or managing through difficult situations and the definition of character and ethics through that?
I haven't read the book in particular, so I can't make a comment on that. But when it comes to difficulty in character, you said, does it, I wanted to touch on two things. One was, does it reveal your character, or does it strengthen it? And I feel like, having been in some difficult situations and having observed just in the moment that I'm on a knife's edge and I could choose to go either way, I feel like it's more of a test on building your character rather than revealing, because sometimes you know you have the choice, and it comes down to what you choose rather than being on autopilot. Of course, there are situations in which you're on autopilot, but in the moments where you do have the choice, you know, where the passions haven't taken over, at that point, it's a test, right? It's building rather than revealing. But I think one of the things that we might have kind of over-focused on here, or in general when it comes to Stoicism, is the importance of adversity. And adversity is important, but that would be like saying that the Olympics are important for an athlete. And it's like, that's true, but the lead up to the Olympics is probably what is their day-to-day and what concerns them most. And Epictetus has, I believe, one of the things about training in winter, right? It's not just about adversity revealing your character. I think how you roll in the good times probably reveals your character more than tests it, right? And so whether it's your daily journaling, whether it's meditating, whatever it is that you do to try and improve your character in the good times and to keep yourself grounded is, in my opinion, probably the thing to focus on, right? Because you don't really know when the adversity is going to come. And this is the second related point I had to that. Which was how sometimes you don't know that there's an adversity or there's a moral crisis, right? Let's say 250 years ago, slavery is the norm. And so what kind of, in that case, there's no obvious reason, or there's no obvious adversity to anyone who's not a slave. And in that time, being against slavery is a test of moral character, even though it's not particularly a hindrance to you, say. So I think that's also another counterexample of where just because the times are good doesn't mean you can let your guard down. And that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept there around, you mentioned slavery, which is a very important topic to address from a historical perspective and what transpired there. And one of the things about ancient Rome which we can't neglect, is that there's this image of marble white floors and big buildings and so forth. But the Romans were brutal, and they were also war focused to expand the empire and maintain the empire to anyone as the empire grew. There was the Parthians, the Gauls, the Spanish, et cetera. So they were always fighting and so forth. So war was a part of that and that culture, but also slavery. So you have this backdrop of huge violence and slavery, and in that within that whole context, we have this perception of Rome and antiquity, et cetera. But these were very difficult times, and I think the voice of Stoicism coming back through to that we still, it's still a very powerful force in today's society. But it started back through a period, and all through that period, the voice of Stoicism could rise above these things and hold itself in a very focused way for morality and high ethical behavior and greater good delivery, when all around it was a very violent situation, and in some cases a very deprived situation as well. So I find it very fascinating to consider that Stoicism has stood the test of time through all of that. Sucrose, what about you? Anything around Dr. Frankl and the meaning of life, or anything around character and ethics under duress?
I haven't read the book either, but I have just added it to my list here. I think, to Drew's point, it's less about revealing your character through adversity or through challenges, and it's more about how you can build your character through it. I mean, and when I think of challenges or adversity, I always think of Seneca. If we always are challenged with weaker opponents, we don't get better. But I do think there's a distinction to be made between the challenges we can foresee and we can plan for when we're thinking about worst case scenarios, versus the challenges or adversity that we don't foresee. And I think that the challenges that we can't foresee or we don't plan for, when all these unknown unknowns, those are the ones that really expose our nature. But I think for me, here's the thing. With Stoicism, you're on a path of self-improvement. You're working on yourself. So in fact, whilst we all as humans, we want to do well at a test. We want to do the best every time. We want that 100%. But in fact, it's through those sorts of challenges where we reveal our nature and where we are at that point in life, and we see how we are, how we've dealt with something. Those are the most valuable moments, because when we say revealed, we don't mean it in a weak way. We're not saying that you failed the test. I think we're saying this has happened, you can learn from it, this is how you can get better. So I think when we say revealed, it's actually it could be quite a powerful turning point there. So I certainly take Drew's point. It's about building on something in a very positive and empowering way.
Very good. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, but I've got a feeling we're going to get one more through here, and then we can talk more in a moment. But this question, and we'll quickly go round. Now, it's a fantastic question. It ties back to what the whole essence of the foundation, but would love to hear this opinion. The question is, how do we get more young people to engage with deeper thinking, Stoicism example, in this manner around Stoic thought, especially in a world that is becoming more superficial and overwhelming in terms of information? So how do we get this message out more in this world based on everything that's going on? Stoicism resonates, but how can we continue to get the message out through people like yourselves and also the networks? So Ross, any insights into how you think the word of Stoicism could get out further?
Yeah, I think just by making Stoicism more generally more accessible to people, because I think the false impression that people might get from sort of classical texts like the ones we've discussed is that they're very dry and dull, and what applicabilities they really have to my life. But actually, when these things are made much more accessible, and you realize, like I said, that Marcus is very relatable despite obviously his his huge amount of power and the difference in lifestyle between his and ours. I think that when we make these things more accessible to young people and we really distill these lessons down, such as the dichotomy of control, which I know we've talked about at length as well, that these simple lessons can really just make you more mindful in your day-to-day life in a way that can be really beneficial. And I know personally, I've made many decisions based off of what I've read within the literature. Not in the sense where I'm constantly going around thinking about what would Marcus think or what would Seneca think, but ultimately when you read something, like with any book, it has an influence on you, and Stoicism has had a really positive influence on me, and my mental health more broadly, I think, in that just not worrying about things which are outside my control, and generally just caring more about my character and being a good person, and as I said, keeping things well within my control. Excuse me, Justin, just on that as well. I think often there can be this impression that we, especially with young people of today like myself, that we need to be perfect, that we need to get everything right. And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves in that way. But to draw it back to Stoicism, I think no one can really be a perfect Stoic, and that's totally okay. I think just as being an aspiring Stoic is, I think, what most of us here are doing.
I think that's right. I think that's particularly reflective when you go through, when you read Aurelius, Seneca, they're always admonishing themselves to get better. That can create, some ways could create pressure, but really it doesn't. It's a total journey to continue to be an aspiring Stoic, and I think you've summarized that extremely well. Very quickly, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Laurie, how can we spread the word better that Stoics are good fun?
I think two things are really important in my opinion. One is events. So whether it's webinars such as this one, seminars, or larger events like Stoicon, it's getting it out there, bringing people together, and offering a platform where the opportunity for people with various levels of understanding or knowledge on the topic to just discuss their experiences, to discuss either the ideology from an academic standpoint, or just personally from anecdotes, or just sharing information. So I think resources are really important. And the second thing will be sharing that information as individuals. So, and that applies to all of us, regardless of what stage we're at in our journey with Stoicism, whether it's sharing a link to an event or an idea with a coworker. I mean, I talked to my manager about Stoicism, about why it's important to me, even though it doesn't directly link to my job, but it does in so many other ways to the way I go about my job, to the way I go about my life. So I think Stoicism isn't just about how the ancient Romans or Greeks viewed it, or about all these theoretical points that we've spoken about, although these create the foundation to Stoicism. I think modern Stoicism, in my view, is really focusing on how can we live better, think better, and just live more happily as individuals and as a society, as communities. So just sharing knowledge. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Sucrose, very quickly, one key sentence on how we could do a better job of getting the message out to you. And then one sentence from Drew as well. Go, please.
Sorry. I think making it relatable, to Ross's point, if we're thinking about time, how many people are Netflix binging, how many teenagers do we see on Amazon Prime? I think it's about making examples from Stoicism, making meditations or different quotes, all those teachings very relevant in today's world. I think the second point, really quickly, is how young is young. I note that everyone else on the panel today discovered Stoicism at university, but actually I think that a lot of the formative years for youngsters are actually in their teens. So maybe a way of getting the message out there is actually getting the Stoic message into schools. I'm certain, absolutely certain, that a lot of the teenagers struggling with GCSEs, A-levels, the difficulties of being at home during the pandemic would really benefit from the Stoic message, would really feel supported and consoled by it. So when we're thinking about young people, I think it's about looking possibly at a younger band and looking at schooling as well.
Very good. Thank you. And then Drew, one focus point on getting the word out there.
Everyone else has mentioned excellent things about sharing content, and I agree wholeheartedly. I would like to focus on superficial aspect of the question. And I think the best way to address that is to have people who embody the philosophy talk to other people in small groups or one-on-one. If you are genuine, that will come across. And if you are in the right situation, as in one-on-one conversation or small groups, then that will create the space for authenticity, and it won't, any superficiality will be very obvious in that situation, but any authenticity will come across and it will leave a lasting impression.
Very good. Well, let's thank you for everyone. Look, we could go on for quite an extended period of time, but we're going to bring the panelists back in a different type of context with conversations around time and youth, responsibility and acceptance, a lot of talk around calmness and serenity and control when things go wrong, but the four virtues give you a chance to focus your life into virtue and getting out in front of things before things go wrong. So there's a lot of great topics here that we'll bring back through this panel as we go forward here. So just in closing off, we highly recommend that this book is read by people who are taking this webinar and that we'll see it later. It's John's done a lot of great work, but I particularly love this book and its pragmatism and real examples of how to apply Stoicism into your life in a very, very pragmatic way. And some quick headlines. Stoicon virtual event starts this Saturday. Very excited about that. It's kicking off. We're wishing Robert and the whole team an opportunity for great success as this kicks off this weekend. The foundation is involved in terms of helping them on a small and considered sponsorship. So we're looking forward to a great weekend. We have Stoic Week beginning next week on October the 19th. So if you haven't signed in, please do so. And then very quickly, we've got some more younger Stoic generational views on webinars coming up in October, November. We have a webinar coming up with Pat Cash in November and December. Come back from the observations at the French Open and the US Open. So we look forward to hearing from Pat. And we are gearing up an event in 2021 later in the year. And I just want to keep referencing this event, which will be in Athens, assuming the world is in some sort of normal state or the new normal, whatever that will be. So once again, thank you, everyone. It was an absolute pleasure to host this webinar with you. So thank you, Ross, Sukraj, Dhruv, and Laurie. And as always, thank you to Holly for the orchestration as well. So on that note, everyone, thank you again and have a wonderful evening. We look forward to continuing the Foundation's work soon and with you all as partners and advisors to the Foundation. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.